2 hours. That's how long I sat at the candlelit table, watching the empty seat across from me, the one Emily was supposed to fill. 10 years of marriage, and she couldn't even send a text. Not a call, not a voicemail, not even an excuse about a meeting running late. Nothing. Just the waiter's polite glances and the whispered hum of other diners who must have noticed the lone man playing with a velvet ring box. The box. I had spent weeks picking out the perfect diamond, the one I thought would remind her of the life we'd built. Now it sat between the wine glasses, a cruel joke instead of a celebration. "Sir, would you like me to box up your meal?" the waiter asked, his voice cutting through my spiral of frustration. "No," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "But there's something else you can do." I leaned in, lowering my voice. "The private room, the one near the staff entrance, does your security camera cover it?" His hesitation told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't sure if he should humor me or call his manager. But the weight of the $100 bill I slipped into his palm must have been persuasive. A few moments later, he returned with a nod. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to confirm what my gut had been screaming all night. There she was, Emily, entering the restaurant not through the front door like any loving wife would, but through the discreet staff entrance. She wasn't alone. Patrick Steele, her so-called VP of sales partner on all those late nights at work, was by her side. They were laughing, their bodies leaning into each other with a familiarity that made my stomach churn. They weren't here for a work meeting. They were here for each other. The waiter fidgeted as I stared at the screen. "Would you like me to do something, sir?" he asked, clearly uncomfortable. "Yes," I said, sliding the ring box toward him. "Charge their meal to my account and deliver this to their table. Tell them it's a gift from the gentleman at table 12. His eyes widened, but he nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. As he disappeared, I moved to the bar, positioning myself where I could see their reactions without being seen. My heart raced as I watched the waiter approach their table, setting the velvet box between them. Emily's smile faltered first, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. Patrick, oblivious, said something I couldn't hear, probably assuming it was some kind of complimentary gift. But when Emily opened the box, her face went pale. No diamond, no sparkling symbol of love, just a USB drive sitting on the velvet cushion. She knew exactly what it meant. Patrick leaned in, his confident smirk fading as Emily whispered something urgently to him. He reached for the USB, but she slapped his hand away, her panic rising. From my vantage point, I could see her hands trembling, her perfect composure unraveling in real time. It was delicious. I signaled for another drink, taking a long, slow sip as I watched them squirm. Their laughter was gone, replaced by frantic whispers and darting glances. They knew. The game was up, and I wasn't done yet. Tomorrow, I'd confront her properly, but tonight was about sending a message. I saw everything. I wasn't the fool she thought I was. From my seat at the bar, I watched them fumble with the ring box. Emily's hands shook as she held it, her eyes darting around the restaurant, probably scanning for me. Patrick leaned closer, his brow furrowed in confusion, whispering something I couldn't hear. For a man who built his career on reading the room, he was painfully slow on the uptake. The waiter stood by their table, politely waiting, his expression neutral. I made sure to choose the most composed member of the staff for this job. No theatrics, just precision. When Emily finally mustered the courage to open the box, her reaction didn't disappoint. She stiffened as if a bucket of ice water had been dumped over her head. The USB inside wasn't just a symbol. It was a loaded gun. It held our wedding video, all those carefully edited moments of joy and commitment, spliced together with something far less romantic. Photos of her and Patrick. Hotel receipts. Time-stamped messages. Proof. Evidence she couldn't deny. Patrick, oblivious to the storm brewing next to him, reached for the USB, but Emily snatched the box away. Her whisper turned into a hiss. From across the room, I could practically feel the tension crackling between them. Patrick's cocky demeanor began to falter. He must have realized this wasn't a gift, it was a reckoning. I waited another moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in, then stood and walked toward their table. My steps were slow, deliberate. Emily froze when she saw me, her face a mask of shock and fear. Patrick, to his credit, tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, not bothering to wait for an answer as I pulled out a chair and sat down. The waiter discreetly placed a glass of whiskey in front of me, his timing impeccable. "Daniel," Emily started, her voice trembling. "Save it," I interrupted, my tone calm but cold. I turned to Patrick. "You're Patrick Steele, right? VP of Sales? Long nights at the office? Company retreats?" I let the words hang in the air, watching his confidence crumble. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Patrick said, his voice wavering. He tried to flash me a disarming smile, but it fell flat. "Emily and I were just what?" I cut him off. "Celebrating your latest expense report? The one where you charged your little business dinners to my corporate account." Patrick's jaw dropped, and Emily's face turned a deep shade of red. She looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. "Let me guess," I continued, leaning back in my chair. "You told Emily you were covering everything, didn't you? That you'd handle it. But you didn't mention whose money you were actually spending." Patrick shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room. He was searching for an escape, but there wasn't one. "Not tonight." I turned to Emily. "And you, dear wife, 10 years of marriage, and this is how you celebrate? By sneaking off with him? Laughing behind my back? Did you even plan to call me? Or was I just supposed to sit at that table all night, waiting for you like a fool?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't in the mood for sympathy. "You really thought I wouldn't find out?" I said, my voice growing colder. "Did you think I wouldn't notice the late nights, the secret phone calls, the sudden interest in working overtime? Or did you just not care?" Patrick finally spoke up, his voice defensive. "Look, this isn't what it looks like." "Really?" I snapped, cutting him off. I reached into my pocket and pulled out another USB. "Because this has everything your wife might need to confirm what a stand-up guy you are. Receipts, photos, even the timestamps on the text you sent Emily while you were at home with her. I'm sure Laura will appreciate the attention to detail." Patrick paled at the mention of his wife. He looked at Emily, then back at me, realizing he'd underestimated just how prepared I was. "You can't do this," he stammered. "This is private." "Private?" I laughed bitterly. "You're sitting in a public restaurant on my dime, with my wife, and you want to talk about privacy?" Emily finally found her voice. "Daniel, please. Can we talk about this? In private?" "Oh, we'll talk," I said, standing up and straightening my jacket. "But not tonight. Tonight, I'm leaving you two to enjoy the rest of your evening. Dinner's on me, after all." I placed the second USB on the table, right next to the untouched breadbasket. "Consider this my parting gift. Patrick, you might want to start thinking about your resume. And Emily, don't bother coming home. I've already changed the locks." Without another word, I walked away, leaving them to stew in their humiliation. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face, and for the first time in hours, I felt a strange sense of calm. This was just the beginning. The house was eerily quiet when I arrived home that night, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak and shuffle. Normally, Emily would be here, pretending everything was fine, offering some excuse about a late meeting or a conference call. But not tonight. Tonight, the house felt hollow, just like our marriage had been for the past year. I poured myself a drink, savoring the burn as I let my mind replay the scene from the restaurant. The look on Patrick's face when I mentioned his wife, priceless. Emily's stammering, her tears, her desperation to justify the unjustifiable. It should have hurt, but all I felt was a strange mix of vindication and clarity. I sat in my office and opened the folder on my computer labeled Contingencies. It was a cruel name, I suppose, but I'd created it when the late nights at the office turned into unexplained weekends and secretive phone calls. Inside were months of evidence, neatly organized. Hotel invoices, dinner receipts, even screen grabs of messages she thought I'd never see. Patrick Steele wasn't just a philanderer. He was a thief. My corporate account bore the brunt of their affair, fancy dinners, spa treatments, even a weekend getaway billed as a client retreat. He had no shame. And Emily? She'd willingly played along, oblivious or uncaring about how deep this went. The real kicker? Patrick wasn't just stealing from me. He was stealing from her too. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer, Jim. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. Daniel, do you know what time it is? It's urgent, I said. I need you to draft divorce papers. Effective immediately. There was a pause, and then his tone shifted to professional mode. All right. Any specifics I should know? I'll send you everything, I replied. And make sure the prenup is ironclad. She gets nothing. After hanging up, I sifted through the documents, my jaw tightening with every new discovery. Patrick hadn't just been using my corporate funds. He'd also convinced Emily to dip into her retirement savings. Tens of thousands of dollars transferred into his accounts under the guise of investments. I stared at the bank statements, wondering how she could be so gullible. Did she love him that much? Or was she just that blind? The next morning, I decided it was time to unravel their little fantasy. I didn't go to work. Instead, I showed up at Emily's office just as her team was settling in for the day. She wasn't expecting me. Her face turned pale when she saw me standing in the lobby, holding a folder. Daniel, she said, her voice barely a whisper. What are you doing here? We need to talk, I said, loud enough for the receptionist to hear. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. She led me to a conference room, closing the door behind us. Please, don't do this here, she pleaded. I tossed the folder onto the table. Let's skip the theatrics. Do you even know who Patrick really is? Or are you too wrapped up in his lies to care? She hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her blouse. I don't know what you mean. Let me spell it out for you, I said, my voice sharp. Patrick has been stealing from you. From me. From my company. Every romantic dinner, every weekend getaway. It wasn't just my money. It was yours too. He's bled you dry. Her face crumpled, but I didn't let up. Did you even bother to check his credentials? His so-called investments? Or were you too busy playing house with him to notice the red flags? Tears streamed down her cheeks, but I felt no sympathy. He said it was temporary, she whispered, that he'd pay me back once the deal went through. There is no deal, I snapped. There never was. The only thing Patrick's invested in is his offshore account, where he's been funneling your money. And mine. Her eyes widened. Offshore account? I pulled out another document, a bank statement from one of Patrick's shell companies. This is where your money went. And when the SEC gets involved, they'll find everything. Fraud. Embezzlement. Insider trading. You think your name won't come up? You think you're innocent in all this? She sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. I didn't know, she sobbed. I swear, I didn't know. Maybe not at first, I said coldly, but you knew enough to keep lying to me, to keep taking from me. I stood up, gathering the folder. Enjoy your day, Emily. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. As I left her office, I felt a mix of anger and relief. She'd made her choices, and now she'd have to face the consequences. Patrick wasn't just a mistake. He was her downfall, and I wasn't about to let either of them drag me down with them. That evening, I received a call from Jim. The papers are ready, he said. We can file first thing tomorrow. Do it, I replied. And while you're at it, notify the SEC. They'll want to see these accounts. I hung up, staring out the window as the city lights blurred in the distance. This was just the beginning. Emily's world was starting to crumble, and I was going to make sure she felt every tremor. The fallout began faster than I anticipated. By the time Emily returned home the next evening, I had already set things in motion. She looked exhausted, her usually polished appearance marred by dark circles under her eyes and a strained expression. She dropped her purse by the door and froze when she saw me sitting in the living room, a thick stack of papers on the coffee table between us. Daniel, she began, her voice uncertain. Sit, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. She sat hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I slid the stack of papers toward her. These are copies of everything the SEC has been sent. Bank statements, transaction logs, email correspondences. You might want to review them. Her face turned ashen as she flipped through the documents. I didn't know it was this bad, she whispered. Didn't you? I leaned forward, my voice low and biting. You handed him your retirement savings. You signed off on transfers without question. What exactly did you think was happening? I thought, she trailed off, tears filling her eyes. I thought I was helping him. You weren't helping him, I said coldly. You were enabling him, and now you're complicit. Her sobs filled the room, but I felt no pity. This wasn't a moment for comfort. She had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. Your parents have been informed, I continued. I sent them the same evidence. Your father called me this afternoon. He was less than pleased. Her head snapped up, panic flashing in her eyes. You told my parents? Of course I did, I said. Did you think I'd keep this a secret? Your father's invoking the morality clause in the family trust. You're cut off, Emily. No more safety net. She gasped, the weight of my words sinking in. He wouldn't do that. Oh, he would, I said. And he already has. As of today, your access to the trust is revoked. Her sobs turned into wails, but I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. This is just the beginning, I said, more to myself than to her. The next day brought more chaos. Emily's office was buzzing with rumors after Patrick's wife, Laura, made a dramatic appearance. She stormed into the building, a file of incriminating evidence in hand, and demanded answers. Emily was humiliated in front of her colleagues as Laura berated her, calling her every name in the book and making sure everyone knew exactly what had happened. By lunchtime, Emily's email was disabled, and security escorted her out of the building. Her career, once her pride and joy, was over in a matter of hours. The news spread quickly, and by the time she arrived home, she was a shadow of the woman she'd been. She stood in the doorway, her shoulders slumped, her face pale. I lost everything today, she said softly. Not everything, I replied, barely looking up from the documents I was reviewing. You still have Patrick. Her laugh was bitter, almost hysterical. Patrick? He's disappeared. His phone's off. His office is empty. He's gone. I set my papers down and met her gaze. Of course he's gone. Did you really think he'd stick around once the SEC got involved? He used you, Emily, just like he used me. She crumpled onto the couch, her head in her hands. What do I do now? She whispered. That's not my problem, I said, standing and heading to the door. You made your bed. Now you get to lie in it. As I left the house, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, satisfaction, and a faint pang of pity. Emily's world was falling apart, but it was a collapse of her own making. I had no intention of saving her. By the time Emily realized the full depth of Patrick's betrayal, it was too late. I found her sitting at the kitchen table when I got home, her face pale and her eyes hollow. Papers were spread out before her. Bank statements, text messages, fragments of a life she thought she understood but had never truly seen. Daniel, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. We need to talk. I placed my briefcase by the door and crossed my arms. Talk? Now you want to talk? She flinched, and for the first time, I saw something in her I hadn't expected. Fear. Not the fear of losing me, but the fear of the mess she'd tangled herself in. The fear of consequences. I didn't know, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't know he was lying to me about everything. I walked over and grabbed a piece of paper from the pile. It was a bank statement showing a transfer to one of Patrick's Shell accounts. You didn't know? You signed off on this. You didn't question where your money was going, even when it drained your retirement savings? She buried her face in her hands. I thought he was investing it. He said it was for us, for our future. For your future? I scoffed, throwing the paper back onto the table. Did your future include him gambling it all away? Because that's exactly what he's been doing. Her head shot up, her face etched with confusion. Gambling? I pulled out another file, one I'd been saving for this moment. It contained detailed reports of Patrick's gambling debts, his frequent visits to underground casinos, and the mounting losses he'd tried to hide. Patrick wasn't building a future with you, Emily. He was using you to fund his addiction. And when the SEC came knocking, he bolted. Her hands trembled as she reached for the file, her eyes scanning the evidence. No, she whispered. He wouldn't do that to me. Wake up, Emily. I snapped. Patrick Steele is a con artist. He played you. He played me. And now he's playing the escape game, leaving you to deal with the fallout. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the papers. Where is he now? She asked, her voice cracking. Probably halfway across the world, I said coldly. The SEC issued a notice to detain him, but he's smarter than that. He knew the walls were closing in, so he ran. And he didn't even have the decency to warn you. She slumped back in her chair, the weight of my words crushing her. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. You know what the worst part is? I continued, leaning forward. You're not just a victim here. You're an accomplice. Those bank transfers? Those business expenses? They tie you directly to his fraud. The SEC isn't going to see you as an innocent bystander. They're going to see you as his partner. Her eyes widened, and she shook her head vehemently. No, I didn't know. They don't care what you knew, I cut her off. They care about what you did. And right now, you look guilty as hell. She sat there, broken and silent, as I gathered the files and stood to leave. I'm meeting with my lawyer tomorrow, I said. The divorce papers are ready. You can sign them willingly, or I can take this to court. Either way, I'm done. Daniel, please, she begged, her voice desperate. Don't do this. I made a mistake, but I love you. I can fix this. We can fix this. I stopped in the doorway and turned to face her. You don't fix a decade of betrayal, Emily. You endure it, you survive it, and then you move on. That's exactly what I'm doing. As I walked out of the house, I felt a strange sense of finality. Emily's pleas echoed in my mind, but they carried no weight. She had chosen her path, and now she was watching it collapse beneath her feet. Patrick had betrayed her, just as she had betrayed me, and there was no undoing the damage. I drove to my lawyer's office the next morning, signed the papers, and filed them with a sense of grim satisfaction. Emily had begged for understanding, but I wasn't the man I used to be. This wasn't about reconciliation or forgiveness. It was about taking back control of my life. Patrick's betrayal may have set the stage, but Emily's choices had written the script. Now, she'd have to live with the consequences, just like the rest of us. Patrick's arrest was splashed across every business news channel within days. The SEC had finally caught up with him at a high-end restaurant in Chicago, his signature smug smile fading into panic as federal agents cuffed him in the middle of his steak dinner. The headlines were relentless. VP of Sales busted in massive fraud scheme. I followed the news closely, watching as more of his schemes unraveled. Offshore accounts, shell companies, insider trading. It was as if Patrick had been running a masterclass in white-collar crime for years. The man wasn't just reckless, he was audacious. He hadn't just stolen from me. He'd swindled several other businesses, colleagues, and even investors who had trusted him. Emily, meanwhile, was drowning in the fallout. Her role in Patrick's schemes wasn't as significant, but it was enough to get her entangled in the legal mess. She had unknowingly signed off on some of his shady transactions, making her an accessory in the eyes of the law. Probation and hefty fines replaced any hope she had of a clean slate. She had avoided prison, but not disgrace. When she received her sentence, she called me. Her voice was hollow, devoid of the self-assured tone I had grown accustomed to. Daniel, she began, pausing as if searching for the right words. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. Her apology didn't stir any sympathy in me. Sorry doesn't erase what you did, I said. It doesn't undo the lies, the betrayal, or the damage. You made your choices, Emily. Now you live with them. I didn't mean for it to end like this, she said, her voice cracking. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, I replied coldly. And you hurt yourself in the process. You threw everything away for a man who saw you as a pawn. You should have known better. She was silent for a long moment. I've signed the divorce papers, she said finally. You'll have them by the end of the day. Good, I said. It's time we close this chapter. The divorce process was swift, thanks to the prenup I'd insisted on when we got married. Emily walked away with nothing. No alimony, no claim to the house, and no share of my assets. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had left me for a man who promised her the world, only to end up with less than she started with. Patrick, on the other hand, was facing decades in prison. The court documents revealed just how deep his crimes went. He'd been skimming money off the top of every deal he touched, funneling millions into offshore accounts. He had used Emily not just for her money, but as a shield, a way to legitimize his fraudulent activities. The SEC uncovered everything, including damning text messages where Patrick referred to her as useful but naive. When I read that, I almost laughed. She had betrayed me for a man who saw her as nothing more than a tool. Her life continued to crumble. Laura, Patrick's wife, had filed a civil suit against both Emily and Patrick, seeking restitution for the money he'd stolen. The lawsuit forced Emily to sell her remaining assets, including her car and the jewelry Patrick had gifted her during their affair. She was left with nothing but a mountain of debt and a tarnished reputation. The last time I saw her was during the divorce hearing. She looked like a ghost of herself, her once polished appearance replaced by a worn, defeated look. She didn't meet my eyes as the judge finalized our divorce, her signature on the papers sealing the end of a decade-long chapter of my life. Walking out of the courtroom that day, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The weight of her betrayal was no longer mine to carry. Emily's choices had brought her to ruin, and Patrick's manipulations had ensured her downfall. They had both gambled with other people's lives, and now they were paying the price. As I drove home, I thought about the anniversary dinner that had set all of this in motion. The ring I had planned to give her was still in its box, untouched. It was a painful reminder of what I had lost, but also of what I had gained: clarity, strength, and the resolve to never let anyone take advantage of me again. Emily's life was in ruins, but I wasn't looking back. The divorce was finalized. Patrick was in custody, and I was finally free. The headlines had faded, but the whispers hadn't. Emily had become the subject of hushed conversations in every corner of her old life: her friends, her colleagues, even her parents' social circles. Her disgrace was public and inescapable. Every time I heard her name mentioned, it wasn't with sympathy or regret. It was always accompanied by a shake of the head or a knowing smirk. She was now a cautionary tale, the woman who lost everything to greed and betrayal. Patrick's wife, Laura, was relentless in her pursuit of justice. Her lawsuit not only targeted Patrick but also Emily, who had become an unwitting accomplice to his schemes. Laura's legal team left no stone unturned, demanding restitution for every penny Patrick had siphoned away. The courts ruled in her favor, and Emily was forced to liquidate her remaining assets to pay the damages. The house we'd built together was long gone. The car she used to drive, her designer wardrobe, even her jewelry, everything was sold off. Emily moved back to her hometown, a place she had once sworn she'd never return to. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had spent years cultivating an image of success and sophistication, only to end up in a tiny studio apartment, working as a receptionist at a local clinic. I heard about her new life through mutual acquaintances, though I never sought out the information. It came to me unbidden, like a stray thread in an otherwise finished tapestry. She kept to herself, avoiding the social gatherings she used to revel in. Her parents had cut her off completely, their once proud daughter now a source of shame. Her father's words, relayed to me through a mutual friend, echoed in my mind. She made her bed. Let her lie in it. And lie in it she did. One day, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a letter and a small photograph. The letter was from Emily. Her handwriting, once so familiar, looked shakier than I remembered. Daniel, it began. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to say it. I'm sorry. For everything. For the lies, the betrayal, the pain I caused you. There isn't a day that goes by where I don't think about what I did. You were a good husband, better than I deserved, and I ruined it. Patrick wasn't who I thought he was. But that doesn't excuse what I did. I should have seen it sooner. I should have valued what we had. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying to rebuild my life, even if it's in pieces now. The photo is of the little place I call home. It's not much, but it's mine. I wish you happiness, Daniel. You deserve it. More than anyone I know. The photograph showed a modest apartment complex, its paint peeling and the lawn overgrown. It was a stark contrast to the life she once lived, but there was something in the image that struck me. A glimpse of humility, perhaps, or an acknowledgement of the choices that had led her there. I folded the letter and set it aside, unsure of what to feel. It wasn't vindication or anger, but something softer, a quiet recognition that Emily was no longer the woman who had betrayed me. She was someone else now, someone humbled by the weight of her mistakes. But even as I acknowledged her attempt at redemption, I knew I couldn't let her back into my life. Some wounds, no matter how much time passes, don't heal. My own life was moving forward. I had started rebuilding, piece by piece. The house felt less empty these days, not because of anyone else, but because I had filled it with purpose. Friends, hobbies, and work had become my foundation. I wasn't the same man I had been when I sat alone at that anniversary dinner table. The anniversary ring, which once symbolized love and hope, now held a different meaning. I had donated it to a charity auction, knowing it could serve a better purpose than sitting in a drawer. The proceeds went to a fund for victims of financial fraud, a small way of finding meaning in the chaos Emily and Patrick had caused. As for Emily, I wished her no ill will. Her life was her own to rebuild, just as mine was. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I was free. And that was all I needed. Patrick's downfall was the kind of scandal the media thrives on, and the SEC investigation ensured that no stone was left unturned. Day by day, the scope of his fraudulent activities grew more astonishing. Offshore accounts were discovered, hidden under layers of shell companies with names so generic they screamed deception. Millions of dollars had been funneled into these accounts, money stolen from corporations, individuals, and even unsuspecting investors. But the part that struck me most was the double betrayal. Patrick hadn't just been stealing from businesses. He'd been stealing from Emily, too. The SEC investigators uncovered a chilling pattern in his financial dealings. While Emily believed she was investing in their future together, Patrick had been charging her for the very affair that destroyed our marriage. Every dinner, every hotel room, every extravagant gesture, they weren't gifts from him. They were expenses billed to her, masked as partnership contributions or temporary investments. I found out about this through a contact at the SEC who knew I had a personal stake in the matter. Daniel, he said during a phone call, you need to see this. It's beyond what we expected. When I saw the documents, I couldn't decide whether to laugh or feel pity for Emily. She had been manipulated in the most calculated way possible. Patrick had used her as a pawn, not just emotionally but financially, and she had let him. When the details became public, the media pounced. Headlines painted Patrick as the ultimate con artist, but Emily wasn't spared. VP's lover caught in fraud scandal was splashed across online articles, turning her into an unwilling accomplice in the court of public opinion. Her name was dragged through the mud, her actions scrutinized by people who knew nothing about her except what they read in the news. The fallout was relentless. People whispered about her in grocery stores. Old friends stopped returning her calls. She became a pariah, and every attempt to rebuild her life seemed futile. And yet, through it all, she refused to reach out to me again. I thought she might, perhaps to ask for help, or even just to apologize one more time. But she didn't. Whether it was pride, shame, or both, Emily stayed silent. The final blow came in the form of a bill, a calculated, deliberate act on my part. I had instructed the restaurant from our anniversary night to send her the final check for the dinner she had shared with Patrick. Every drink, every dish, and even the exorbitant service charge was itemized, along with a simple note. This was supposed to be for us. Remember what you threw away. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was closure. For years, I had been the man who gave and forgave, the one who turned a blind eye to late nights and evasive excuses. That bill was my way of reclaiming my power, a small but significant reminder that her actions had consequences. When I handed the details of Patrick's offshore accounts over to the SEC, I didn't feel guilt. If anything, I felt a sense of justice. His crimes went far beyond his affair with Emily. He had ruined lives, shattered careers, and stolen from people who trusted him. He deserved everything coming his way. The SEC investigation wrapped up with Patrick's conviction. He was sentenced to decades in prison, his once bright future reduced to a cold, gray cell. The media moved on to the next scandal, and the public forgot his name, but I didn't. For me, Patrick was a reminder of the dangers of trusting too deeply, of ignoring the warning signs that are always there if you're willing to see them. Emily's life was now a shadow of what it had been. The woman who once walked into rooms with confidence and charm was now a ghost, living in anonymity, haunted by her mistakes. I didn't reach out to her after the investigation ended. What was there left to say? She had chosen her path, and I had chosen mine. But in a way, Patrick and Emily gave me something valuable: clarity. They taught me the importance of boundaries, of self-respect, and of recognizing my own worth. I wouldn't be the same man I was before all of this began, and for that, I was strangely grateful. As for the bill I sent her, I never found out if she paid it. It didn't matter. The message wasn't in the payment, it was in the act itself. A final punctuation mark in a story that no longer defined me. I was free. The unused anniversary ring had sat in my desk drawer for weeks, untouched and forgotten. Every time I opened that drawer, it stared back at me, a glittering reminder of what could have been. At first, I avoided it, shoving the drawer closed quickly as if that act alone could erase the pain. But one day, as I sat at my desk with the morning sunlight streaming through the window, I opened the drawer deliberately and took the ring out. It was beautiful, simple yet elegant, the way Emily used to describe the things she loved. I had spent weeks picking it out, imagining her face when I slipped it onto her finger. Back then, it had symbolized hope, love, and the promise of a future we were supposed to share. Now, it was just a hollow object, stripped of its meaning. I knew I couldn't keep it. It wasn't just the memories tied to it. It was the weight of it, the emotional baggage that came with knowing what it represented. I needed to let it go, but not in some trivial way. No, I wanted it to mean something. If my marriage had crumbled into ashes, perhaps something good could rise from those ruins. That's when I contacted a charity organization that specialized in helping victims of fraud. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very ring that was supposed to commemorate a marriage destroyed by deceit would now aid those whose lives had been shattered by similar betrayals. The charity was hosting a high-profile auction, and the ring became one of their featured items. I didn't attend the event in person, but I followed it online, watching as the bids climbed higher and higher. Each increment felt like a step toward closure, a reminder that beauty and purpose could still emerge from something broken. By the end of the night, the ring had sold for a staggering amount, the proceeds going directly to families who had been defrauded by people like Patrick. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. In letting go of the ring, I was letting go of the bitterness, the anger, and the grief that had consumed me. I was turning something painful into something meaningful. The weeks that followed felt lighter somehow. The auction had marked a turning point, a symbolic shedding of the past. For the first time in months, I found myself looking forward instead of backward. The ring, once a reminder of betrayal, was now a token of resilience, not just for me, but for the people it would help. One evening, I received an email from the charity. It was a thank you note, accompanied by a photo of a family who had benefited from the auction. A single mother and her 2 children, smiling brightly despite the hardships they had endured. Their gratitude was palpable, their hope infectious. For the first time in a long time, I felt a genuine smile tug at the corners of my mouth. I printed the photo and pinned it to my bulletin board. It wasn't about self-congratulation. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's a way to find light. The ring had once symbolized a love that had failed, but now it stood for something far greater: healing, growth, and the power of turning pain into purpose. As for Emily, I didn't hear from her again after the divorce was finalized. Mutual acquaintances occasionally updated me on her life, but I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. She was a chapter one had closed, a lesson I had learned. Her story no longer intersected with mine, and I was at peace with that. The auction, the donation, the family who had found hope. It all felt like the final piece of a puzzle I had been trying to solve since the night of our anniversary. I had spent so much time asking why, replaying every moment, searching for answers that would never come. But in letting go of the ring, I realized something important. Not every question needs an answer. Sometimes, the only way to move forward is to stop looking back. And that's exactly what I did. Moving forward wasn't as dramatic as I had imagined it would be. There was no grand declaration, no sudden moment of clarity where the world suddenly felt lighter. Instead, it was a slow, deliberate process, one step at a time, one day at a time. I woke up, went to work, saw friends, and tried to reclaim the parts of myself that had been buried under the weight of betrayal. At first, it felt unnatural. For so long, my identity had been tied to being Emily's husband. Even after her affair, I had still been the man who was betrayed, my life defined by the actions of others. But as the weeks turned into months, I began to realize that I didn't have to carry that label anymore. I was more than what had happened to me. It started with small things. I redecorated the house, stripping away the remnants of the life Emily and I had built together. Her photos came down, replaced by artwork and mementos that reflected who I was, not who we had been. The furniture she had picked out was sold or donated, making way for pieces I actually liked. It was therapeutic in a way, reclaiming my space and making it my own. Work became a refuge. I threw myself into projects, focusing on rebuilding the business that Patrick had tried to exploit. The company had taken a hit during the scandal, but with time and effort, we recovered. The team rallied around me, their loyalty and support a reminder that not everything in my life had been tainted by deceit. In fact, the experience had made me a better leader. More cautious, yes, but also more empathetic. I understood the value of trust in a way I never had before. Socially, I started reconnecting with people I had neglected during my marriage. Old friends, colleagues, even distant family members, they all became part of my new support system. I found myself saying yes more often, to invitations, to new experiences, to opportunities one would have once ignored. Life, it turned out, was much bigger than the narrow world I had been living in. But the most significant change was internal. For the first time in years, I began to truly reflect on who I was and what I wanted. I started journaling, something I hadn't done since college, pouring my thoughts and feelings onto the page without fear of judgment. It was messy and raw, but it helped me process everything I had been through. The anger, the hurt, the guilt. It all spilled out, leaving room for something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I didn't rush into anything romantic. The thought of opening myself up to someone else felt daunting, almost impossible. But I knew that one day, when I was ready, I would. The scars Emily had left were still there, but they were healing. Slowly, surely, I was learning to trust again. Not just others, but myself. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old box in the attic, I found a forgotten photo album from the early years of my marriage. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what I would feel. But as I flipped through the pages, I didn't feel anger or sadness. Instead, I felt gratitude. Those years hadn't been all bad. There had been love, laughter, and moments of genuine happiness. They were part of my story, but they didn't define me. I closed the album and set it aside, not as a relic of pain, but as a reminder of growth. If I had learned anything from this journey, it was that life is never static. It ebbs and flows, breaks and heals. What matters isn't the fall, it's how you rise. The ring I had once bought for Emily had found a new purpose, and in a way, so had I. Her betrayal, as painful as it had been, had forced me to confront parts of myself I had ignored for years. It had taught me resilience, self-worth, and the importance of letting go. Emily's story would forever be a cautionary tale, a reminder of the cost of greed and betrayal. But my story? It was one of redemption, of finding strength in the face of adversity and rediscovering the joy of simply living. I wasn't the same man who had sat at that anniversary dinner table, waiting for a wife who never came. That man was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and, dare I say it, happier. The future wasn't something to fear anymore. It was something to embrace. And so, I did.